Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. He spent 7 years holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy in London and is now in the city's Belmarsh prison awaiting possible extradition to the United States. This to face charges for violating the US Espionage Act by publishing military and diplomatic files in 2010. I'm talking about Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks and the man some see as a hero and others have described as the most dangerous man in the world. And The Most Dangerous Man in the World is the title of a 2011 book about Julian Assange by the investigative journalist Andrew Fowler, whose most recent work, Shooting the Messenger, Criminalising Journalism, is published by Routledge. And Andrew Fowler joins me now. Andrew, thanks for joining us for the France 24 interview. Now, with the decision possibly to extradite fairly quickly Julian Assange to the United States, you met him on several occasions, most recently, I believe, in 2016, in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. What do you think is going through his mind while he's sitting in Belmarsh prison?
I think at the moment, if you read the United Nations Reporter on Torture's report on Julian Assange, I think he is under extraordinary psychological pressure. I think he's terrified. I think he feels lonely. I think he feels that he's been, as the UN reporter said, mobbed by the mob. He's actually been attacked by many people who are journalists who supposedly should support him. I think he feels very much alone. And as I say, I think he feels very, very uncertain and very frightened.
Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the personality of Julian Assange. Many people say that he's a journalist. Some say that he's a militant. Others say he's an opportunist. Others say that he's fighting for the rights of the press. Where would you place him in all of those descriptions?
Well, I don't think it's really important to place him in any of those descriptions, because if we start placing Assange as being a journalist or an activist or somebody who's a militant, then we miss the point of the work that he does. As a journalist, which is what the High Court has described him as, and he's won many journalistic awards, I mean, that will do. The argument that he needs to be a certain kind of journalist really does, I think, miss the point. He's done journalistic work. He's recognised as being a journalist. The important point to remember is if you take away Julian Assange's journalism or the fact that he's a journalist, you remove one of the major credentials that he has that defends himself against the espionage in the United States. Because it's the Espionage Act that if you're a journalist, you can publish material without suffering the consequences of it. You're protected to a certain extent. Stripping him of his title of journalist has always been the objective of those that oppose the work that Assange does.
Yes, but many people could argue that Julian Assange has brought all this on himself by his reckless behaviour in publishing documents that maybe should not have been published. OK, I'm not talking about the 2010 documents which showed the shooting of civilians in Iraq, the collateral murder video. But if you go forward in time to the publication of emails that were apparently submitted by Russia over the Hillary Clinton campaign, WikiLeaks and Julian Assange are being accused of having helped Donald Trump win the presidential election.
And really, what was wrong with that? As a journalist, if you get material, as Assange did, from whatever source, and you can corroborate it and make sure that it's accurate and that it's in the public interest to know, and I think the Hillary Clinton emails that you mentioned were in the public interest to know. They showed that Hillary Clinton was getting an unfair advantage, supported inside the Democrat Party by people that opposed Bernie Sanders' ascendancy and supported Clinton, and he published those emails. Now, I ask you, is there a journalist, and a real journalist I'd say, on the planet who wouldn't, armed with that material, knowing it was right, publish it? It was clearly in the public interest to know that Hillary Clinton and the rest inside the Democrat Party were up to no good to stop Sanders. That was a point to be made.
What is Julian Assange's driving force? This is something that it's very difficult to pinpoint as a personality. Julian Assange. Everybody knows who he is, but at the same time, nobody really knows who he is. You've met him on several occasions. What's your reading of that?
I can only speak of Julian Assange that I know, and I've met him on several occasions, including inside the Ecuadorian embassy on a couple of times. I interviewed him 3 times before that. I find him to be a very personable, very straightforward, very easy person to deal with. Although I've never worked with him, and people that work with him say he's very prickly, I found him to be very generous and very humorous, not the kind of portrait that's painted by those people that oppose the work he does. And I think if you look at the people that criticise Assange, mainly they're the people that don't support his work. But to answer your question about the kind of character he is, he's extremely intelligent, extremely capable, extremely humorous, extremely self-deprecating, but also knows what he wants. And he doesn't agree with the way that the what we call the traditional media often operate. And that's what puts him in conflict with people like The Guardian at times.
But if you look at the way things have turned out for him, after 7 years in the Ecuadorian embassy, he went in there after he jumped bail. But at the same time, he says that he enjoys taking risks. But the risk was that he could have been extradited to Sweden to face charges of rape, and then after that extradited to the United States. Why didn't he take that risk, and why did he then go and hide in the Ecuadorian embassy over all these years to avoid that, if he enjoys taking risks?
That's a very good question. He's a risk taker, I think, who, like most people who take risks, and journalists, myself included, take calculated risks. The problem is you don't like to lose. On the issue of whether or not he should have gone to Sweden, it's a difficult point to make, difficult point to argue. But the point is that Assange was due to appeal to the Human Rights Court on the night before he was due to be extradited. And what he did was he made a decision to go into the Ecuadorian embassy rather than run the risk of going into prison in either England or in Sweden, where he would then face the extradition to the United States that he feared and spoke about, and people denied was going to happen. They said, this is a ridiculous thing. How can you possibly say you'll be extradited to the United States? And he said, that's the main game. And like you asked me about his personality, the thing about Julian is, and it's infuriating, is that he's so often right about what he says. So many years ago, he warned of this, and he's been proven right.
You've seen these images of him back in April when he was taken out of the Ecuadorian embassy. I think many people found those images quite shocking, not only the way he was taken out, but also the way he looked. I think you described at the time of him looking a bit like Saddam Hussein looked when he was captured. What kind of effect did those years living there have on him?
Well, firstly, I think the dragging of Assange out of the embassy was to humiliate him, which is part of the United Nations report on torture says the humiliation of Assange was all part of the psychological warfare to destroy him. What effect those years had on Assange inside the embassy? How is it possible to remain inside a very small enclosed area for so long and still remain coherent? I don't know, but Assange is a remarkable character. That's the reason why he is such a threat to so many people, because he is unbreakable, or at least he has been until now. I think his time now in Belmarsh, you're actually getting the first view of what he's actually been through, the cumulative effect of it. And a couple of medical doctors with the UN have actually seen him in Belmarsh and said he is basically a psychological wreck. He really has problems stringing thoughts together. That's not the Assange I know. He seems to be in rather grave danger at the moment. Now,
if this extradition goes ahead, there are 18 charges which have been levelled against him already. If he goes to the United States and faces the Espionage Act, he could then be put in prison, and that doesn't cover press freedom legislation. What does that say about freedom of the press, do you think?
I think this case is one of the most significant cases for decades, if not hundreds of years, relating to press freedom. I think if Julian Assange is jailed in the United States, what's happened already has sent a chilling effect into journalism, into investigative journalism. I think it's a question that all journalists need to ask themselves, all members of the public need to ask themselves. If Assange is extradited and is prosecuted in the United States, he will suffer possibly torture. He will suffer loss of freedom of speech. He will, in fact, be a martyr to the decent, honest, open journalism that journalists crave and that people in democracies seem to take for granted without understanding the extraordinary risks that people take in, like Assange, in bringing this kind of information to them. I think it's a great danger to us all. We had a raid on the ABC in Sydney just the other week, where I used to work as a reporter for Four Corners. And that raid, I would suggest, would not have taken place in a different climate. The climate is that the national security state, for want of a better word, is now feeling emboldened to step into newsrooms and go through reporters' files and go through emails on fishing expeditions looking for information which is indeterminate. We don't know what they were actually looking for. The warrant was very, very broad. So who's going to get some documents? Who's going to run the risk of receiving documents in Australia, particularly where there is no defence for holding classified material? You face between 2 and 7 years prison for that. I think it's having a tremendous chilling effect. And just the last point is that these are the stories that really matter. I mean, the stories about road safety, the stories about buildings in Paris or whatever it is, those stories are important, but the most important stories are war and peace. And this is a story of war and hopefully peace.
Andrew Fowler, thank you very much indeed for joining us. A reminder of your book, Shooting the Messenger, Criminalising Journalism, which is published by Routledge. And thank you for being our guest on this edition of The Interview on France 24. Until next time, thanks for joining us and goodbye.